As the F1 circus made its way back to Europe, lawmakers in Germany sat down to vote on whether to move the capital of the newly reunited nation back to Berlin. The obvious symbolic choice was to do so, but while the current West German capital Bonn had received a massive investment in new state-of-the-art facilities recently, Berlin was a city still recovering from 40 years of division. After much debate, it was decided to go with Berlin, but acknowledging that it would be a long-term project as much of the city centre needed to be heavily rebuilt. A couple of days later, the Yugoslav republics of Slovenia and Croatia, having both held successful referenda on the subject, declared their independence. The government in Belgrade declared this to be unconstitutional. There was a mechanism for a republic to leave Yugoslavia, but it had to be approved by all the member states, and the following morning units of the Yugoslav People's Army left their barracks in Rijeka, Croatia, heading for the Italian border. They were met by barricades and demonstrations, but nobody seemed to want to be the first to open fire. In the days leading up to the declaration, the Slovenian government had quietly ensured that the federal officials manning Ljubljana airport and international border posts were all Slovenian, and on the morning they simply changed the patches on their uniform and instantly took over those installations. The Yugoslav government had believed that Slovenians would back down after a show of force, and that Croatia would then fall in line, but instead shooting broke out, and 2 federal helicopters were shot down over Ljubljana, one of which it turned out was piloted by a Slovenian and was just ferrying bread to the troops. Alarmed by what looked like the imminent outbreak of a full-blown civil war right on its border, the European community started diplomatic moves to broker a peaceful solution, as Slovenian forces achieved a couple of successes, capturing some Yugoslavian tanks and forming their own armoured unit, while repulsing an amphibious landing. After a few more days of fighting, in which the Slovenians successfully repulsed Yugoslav attacks, the EC-brokered ceasefire came into effect, and both Yugoslav and Slovenian troops returned to their barracks. Whatever came next, it seemed, was in the hands of diplomats and politicians rather than soldiers. On the day of the French Grand Prix, the Brioni Accord formalised the end of what became known as the 10-Day War, recognising Slovenian and Croatian de facto independence, but with the republics taking no further action to change the status quo for 3 months. With Slovenia already in control of its own territory anyway, this worked out great for them, but Croatia still had plenty of major federal bases, while signing the agreement fatally torpedoed the Yugoslav government in its efforts to keep the fracturing federation together. All of which rather stole the headlines from the official dissolution during those 10 days of Comecon and the Warsaw Pact, the economic and military organisations respectively that formerly made up the Eastern Bloc. The Comecon states had begun trading with each other on a hard currency market basis at the start of 1991, which proved to be the last straw. After a March conference in Prague discussing non-existent 5-year plans, the organisation decided to disband itself, while it was plain that the newly post-communist states of Eastern Europe had no interest in fighting for the USSR, and indeed several had joined the US-led coalition liberating Kuwait, so the Warsaw Pact also seemed rather surplus to requirements. The sleepy provincial town of Manny-Cours in the department of Nièvre had a population of a smidge over 1,000 in 1959, when the local mayor, Jean Bernigard, with the backing of local Senator François Mitterrand, opened a karting track, which did well enough to become the site of the famous Winfield Racing School. By 1996, the population of Manny-Cours now having soared to 1,400, Monsieur Mitterrand was coming to the end of his first term as president, and was looking for a big prestige investment in his home district in case he had to go back to being their senator again. A personal friend of the president was Guy Ligier, and F1 was never far from his mind, and the idea was born of converting the old kart track into a full-blown racing circuit, hoping to attract testing contracts at the very least, but ideally the glittering prize of the French Grand Prix. This was 1986, and Elio De Angelis had just been killed in an accident at the Paul Ricard circuit, and the subsequent changes to that track had been unpopular. By 1988, when Mitterrand was re-elected as president, the work was done, and Guy Ligier moved his factory to the newly christened Circuit de Nevers Manny-Cours, thus benefiting from what was essentially a state-funded private test track, in addition to the lavish sponsorship from state-owned tobacco brand Gitan. Not that it made a lot of difference on the track, to be honest, but with Jean-Marie Balestre now also on side, Mitterrand was able to pressure a reluctant Bernie Ecclestone into signing a 5-year contract to hold the French Grand Prix at Manny-Cours, with Mitterrand's advisor Jean Glavany appointed president of the circuit's operating company, just to make sure everything ran well. The new surface, barely used, was billiard table smooth and the facilities were top-notch, but Bernie's scepticism was justified in some regards. Route Nationale 7, the main motorway linking Paris with the south of France, runs right by the circuit gates, but that was the only major road in the area, with every other possible approach to the circuit along single-lane country roads. There was almost no hotel accommodation or restaurants in Manny-Cours itself, not a great deal in the nearest town of Nevers, and the nearest major city, Bourges, was just an hour's drive away under ideal conditions. In short, it was going to be an enormous pain in the neck to get to, both for the teams with their transporters and for spectators and journalists. President Mitterrand remained optimistic that new roads would be built and hotels and other amenities would flock to the area following the F1 cash, but his political opponents were already aghast at the huge sums being spent. 250 million francs so far just for upgrades to the N7 alone. A test was arranged in May for several of the F1 teams to have a go on the new track, and hopefully at least everyone agreed the track itself was great. They didn't. Nelson Piquet, a man never shy about expressing himself, used some words unsuitable for a family channel. Smooth, yes, but essentially a series of straights linked by sharp corners. It felt slow and monotonous to drive, and, crucially, it looked as if it was going to be very difficult to pass on with only one real line. Nigel Mansell was a little bit more diplomatic, talking to the BBC on race weekend, but only in his language.
It's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be a nightmare because other than one place on the circuit, and then it's not going to be a safe overtaking manoeuvre. It's going to be down the straight from 300 k's into the hairpin, into the tight hairpin, and unless you get some sort of cooperation, there's going to be a few people hitting one another.
Still, here we all were, and after 3 weeks off, everyone had had a chance for a bit of a break and to get some work done on the cars. And there was, of course, a considerable French contingent within F1, both drivers, teams and engines, for whom doing well at their home race was important. Not least Ligier, who would now have to share their private test track with everyone else, but at least had the convenience of having the factory right there. The team had scored a total of 4 points across the 1987, 88, 89, 90 and so far 91 seasons, so they were desperate for some good news, and appointed Frank Durney to tweak the JS35. It essentially rebuilt the entire thing: side pods, radiators, bottom, cooling, suspension. Guy Ligier himself, meanwhile, was using the opportunity of his home race to do some vital networking as he strove to build that French national team, spending a lot of time with the presidents of race sponsor Rhone Poulenc and Dassault, and Jean-Luc Lagardère, the former CEO of Matra, who had supplied engines to Ligier back in their 70s heyday. Coming off the back of their 1-2 win in Mexico, meanwhile, Renault were also pulling out all the stops on home soil, along with fuelmakers Elf, who apparently had supplied some 50 different concoctions to the team since the start of the year, and also have real-time computer telemetry to the engine to adjust the mix on the fly. The Larrousse team, contrary to many expectations, were also in France, though they had been forced to go into receivership, which should at least allow them to complete the season. There was hope for the future, though, as Gerard announced a partnership with Monaco-based sports car manufacturer Venturi, a possible candidate to take over the company, whose name now appeared on the car's rear wings. And he would continue touting Aguri Suzuki around Japan in the hopes of securing that vital sponsorship. Fellow French strugglers AGS were less hopeful, though a fresh coat of paint, in a fetching two-tone blue colour scheme with a red and yellow stripe, was debuted in the hope of attracting sponsors with a new look, and a new car was promised for later in the year. And the big one, of course, Alain Prost. The new Ferrari 643 was ready, built in 100 days to replace the 642 that their star driver was open about disliking, with aerodynamics inspired by the Williams FW14 and revised suspension. Prost, a lazy and test driver Andrea Montemini had shaken it down at Mugello a week earlier, and the team decided to risk using it at Manny-Cours, particularly because it was both drivers' home race. All professed themselves happier with it than its predecessor, but its V12 engine still seems down on power compared to the Honda V12 or the Renault V10. The Le Mans 24 Hours had also taken place between races, an odd affair as only 3 teams, Tom Walkinshaw's Jaguar, Sauber Mercedes and Peugeot, had actually built cars to the new 1991 regs, and there weren't enough private entries to fill the grid, so it was opened up to a number of Group C sports cars too. The strong Sauber Mercedes lineup of young stars Karl Wendlinger, Michael Schumacher and Fritz Kreutzpointner started well and were expected to dominate, but a series of technical problems late on left them to trail in 5th, while the lightweight Group C Mazda 787B, co-driven by Volker Weidler, Johnny Herbert and Bertrand Gachot, came in to take an unexpected win, the first Le Mans win by a Japanese manufacturer. They were followed home by the 3 Jaguars of Tom Walkinshaw Racing. In non-French news, Jackie Oliver of Arrows and Max Welti of Porsche had announced that they were suspending their joint project temporarily while the Stuttgart firm tried to solve that oil surge problem. They were aiming for a return to track in Japan or possibly next year, so the official line went at least. In the interim, a supply of Hart-tuned short-stroke Cosworth V8s was married to the FA12 chassis, with a gearbox rather bodged up to transmit the power, as the Ford engine is a bit of a different shape to the big Porsche. Ideally, they'd have reverted back to the A11, which was built for the Ford, but it had failed the new crash tests. In the cockpit was a problem too. Alex Caffey arrived to drive, considering himself recovered. Stefan Johansson was already there, contracted to drive. Jackie Oliver refused to allow Caffey to drive, so the Italian drove up the road to Nevers and filed a breach of contract complaint with the district court. A lawyer arrived to explain matters to Jackie Oliver, who slapped him. Stefan Johansson would drive this weekend, and they'd sort the rest out when they got back home to England. As if to underline the somewhat nervy mood around the paddock, on Thursday night, just after the big official reception at the Chateau in Nevers, the power went out at the circuit, and only frantic overnight work by the EDF technicians got it back on again in time for qualifying. Finally, a competitive F1 wheel could turn on the new track, and in very hot conditions it was Andrea de Cesaris who set the pace in PQ, the only driver to lap it in under 1 minute 20, followed by Leto, Guillard and Gachot, Olivier still singing the praises of his new car, and Pirot once again losing out, this time an ignition failure stopped him going better. The Lambos continued their horror show of a season, with Van der Poel ending up in a wall trying to go faster, and Larini breaking a shock absorber, while poor old Chavez might as well not have bothered again. Senna was fastest in Friday's qualifying, with the Renault and Ferrari engines suffering more in the heat than the Honda, but on Saturday cooler temperatures saw everyone's times plummet, and Prost was really enjoying the new Ferrari, while Olivier Guillard ended the session in bad odour after going round for 3 laps while a broken joint sprayed oil across the track. The local hero, Prost that is, not Guillard, sat on pole for most of the session until Riccardo Patrese put in a gung-ho lap in the dying minutes to take his 3rd consecutive pole by 0.23 seconds, with Prost making his first front row start since Phoenix alongside. Senna was 3rd after spinning on Guillard's oil, Mansell, who'd decided to concentrate on fixing his Wraith setup, 4th, then Berg and Alesi 5th and 6th. The two Benettons, struggling with Pirelli tyres that didn't seem to like the circuit at all, were on row 4, followed by Gugelmin and Morbidelli, both having excellent sessions despite in Morbidelli's case a bout of the flu, with the other Minardi 12th. The new Ligier also seemed to be an improvement, with Comas 14th and Boutsen 16th, sandwiching Capelli, with Gachot 19th and the other Jordan just ahead of Herbert in 20th. Guillard got the Fonmetal into the race again, albeit not quite as spectacularly as last time, followed by the two Larrousse Lolas, Brundle, Alboreto and Leto, with Hakkinen failing to qualify for the first time, just 0.2 seconds off his fellow Finn's time after spinning on Guillard's oil. Perhaps unsettled by the goings-on in the footwork garage, Stefan Johansson was slowest of all, nearly 6.5 seconds off pole and behind the two AGSs. Sunday dawned hot again, and despite the huge tailbacks along the N7, some 100,000 paying punters arrived eventually, in many cases, to enjoy the racing. Bernie Eccleston tore a strip off the organisers for the chaos, but at least it was a financial success. Nice problems to have, as they say. President Mitterrand and his finance minister, Pierre Bérégovoy, another senator from the region who'd run Mitterrand's 1988 election campaign, were guests of honour at the race and ensconced themselves in Jean-Marie Balestre's plush corner office at the track. Most drivers decided to start on softer tyres, though with an eye on the soaring track temperatures, Berger and the Ligier boys decided to go with the harder B compound Goodyears, and after a last-minute switch to the spare for Senna, as his engine wasn't quite right in the warm-up, all were ready for the French Grand Prix to take to its 7th home since the championship began in 1950. Just like last time out, Patrese's gearbox let him down at the start. This time it skipped straight over second, going from first to third and leaving him swamped by the others, as, to a roar from the crowd, Prost swept through into the lead, chased by Mansell, with the McLarens 3rd and 4th, then Alesi, the Benettons, Morbidelli, and finally Patrese in 9th. Further back, Herbert stalled but managed to get it moving and headed off after the pack, while Gachot was crowded onto the grass by Guillard and spun into the gravel. Olivier really not winning himself any friends this weekend. By the beginning of lap 2, Prost was already a second and a half ahead of Mansell, who was the same distance from Senna and Berger. Clearly the new car was working well, and Alain was absolutely fired up on home turf after his torrid season so far. Mansell wasn't letting him go, though, and was sticking with Prost while the pair were leaving the McLarens behind. Senna, Berger and Alesi formed another little group of 3, with Berger right up behind Senna and looking like he could be faster, even on harder tyres, if he could get past. In fact, Senna's onboard computer had told him he was using fuel too quickly, so he'd eased off. Morbidelli was looking lively in the Minardi meanwhile, not just fending off Patrese, but getting ahead of Moreno into 7th. That became 6th on lap 7 when Berger's engine gave out. For those keeping score, that's 24 complete racing laps in 4 races for the Austrian, 9 in Monaco, 4 in Canada, 5 in Mexico and 6 in France, with all but the first of those being engine failures. Patrese worked his way up ahead of Moreno too, while just behind the second Benetton, Martini fishtailed into Modena under braking at the Adelaide hairpin. Both cars got moving again, but De Cesaris, in the middle of his own fight with Gugelmin over 11th, was tipped into a spin and had to wait until everyone else had gone past before he could turn round and get moving again. It was not shaping up to be a vintage weekend for Jordan. By the end of lap 8, Prost led Mansell by just under 2.5 seconds, with 14 seconds back to Senna, who was now fending off Alesi, with Piquet 5th and Morbidelli 6th. The young Italian, flu notwithstanding, was clearly enjoying being up with the big boys, but an over-ambitious attempt to pass the triple champion led to an identical accident to his teammate, banging wheels with the Benetton, only this time it was the Minardi that ended up facing the wrong way, while Patrese said grazie very much to his compatriot and nipped through into 5th. Morbidelli, meanwhile, had stalled his Ferrari V12 and was out. With Prost and Mansell way out in front, the main battle on track was between Senna and Alesi over 3rd, while Patrese was closing on the pair at about half a second a lap. The leaders were still going at it hammer and tongs, trading lap records, but not really close enough to be directly racing, much as the French TV director wanted to watch the novelty for this year of Prost leading a race. Nakajima, rumoured to be considering retiring from F1 at the end of the year, retired from the race after spinning into the gravel on lap 13, as Senna continued fending off Alesi. The leaders by now were coming up to lap the first of the backmarkers, Herbert and Alboreto, a tricky task on this new circuit. Johnny got out of the way pretty quick, but Michele proved more reluctant, and then it was Griard and De Cesaris next up. The Italian was on a mission of his own, charging in pursuit of 20th place Martin Brundle, and caught him just as Prost arrived behind. As the Jordan passed the Brabham, Prost was balked, which allowed Mansell to close right up. Martini slid into Modena at Adelaide, again, with again no damage to the cars, as Prost continued being held up by De Cesaris, with Mansell now right under his rear wing. At Adelaide, De Cesaris moved over to let Prost through, but Mansell went even further right and out-braved Prost into the corner, taking the lead on lap 22. Mansell began to slowly pull away from Prost, but there was more traffic to negotiate, notably the warring Martini-Modena pairing. But Stefano was now suffering gear selection problems and had dropped back, so it wasn't a problem in the end. Meanwhile, Martin Brundle had lost third gear and then overloaded the box compensating, and he came in to retire. Patrese, running a rather lonely 5th, came in for fresh tyres, but a long stop lost him a lot of time, even though he didn't lose the place. Then Senna made his own stop next time round, a greased lightning 5.5 second stop, seeing him comfortably out ahead of Patrese. Then it was Prost's turn, a decent stop keeping him second, and emerging between Leto and Herbert. Mansell, who had yet to stop, came to lap Gugelmin, who slammed the door on him at Adelaide, while Alesi made his own stop, which dropped him back behind Senna. Prost was hauling Mansell in hand over fist as the Brit finally got past Gugelmin and came in. Another indifferent Williams stop saw the Ferrari blast through while Nigel was stationary. So, as half-distance approached, Prost led Mansell by about 5 seconds, with Senna, Alesi, Patrese and Piquet still where they'd been for some time. But Prost now had a big queue of traffic to deal with, Moreno, Martini and both Lolas. Behind Prost, as the whole lot of them came up to begin lap 34, were Blundell and De Cesaris, with Mansell arriving behind them. Suzuki dropped out of the middle of the pack with a clutch failure, which made Mansell's job one car easier, but Prost was going through them like a hot knife through butter, easing past Moreno, but Mansell was now much closer, and by the time the Williams had also passed Moreno, the gap was just 3.4 seconds. Prost put his foot down, putting in the first sub-1 minute 20 lap, while Patrese was suffering further gearbox woes and dropping back towards Piquet. Gugelmin was next up, running 7th and chasing Piquet, and this time he moved smartly aside for both Prost and Mansell, while the yellow flags came out on the start-finish line for Mark Blundell, who'd got the last corner all wrong and demolished the front of his Brabham on the wall, a brave Marshall running out to kick debris out of the way after the almost blind final corner. 3 times world champion Prost lapped 3 times world champion Piquet just after halfway, Nelson's car had been knocked slightly out of whack by Morbidelli earlier, and he was having balance issues. Mansell was passed soon after, and closing on Prost, putting up a new lap record on lap 40. Leto had a tyre blowout the following lap as Prost came round to put a third lap on Boutsen, who'd been in a couple of times to pit with a broken bracket holding the bodywork together. But the local hero was having problems now, his gearbox skipping intermittently and his engine losing power at the top end. Mansell, no stranger to a dud gearbox himself, was right in his wheel tracks. Gouillard, having been suffering from reduced performance after his first corner tangle with Gachot, now suffered a radiator failure and his engine expired in a puff of smoke, thankfully without laying oil everywhere this time, though he still toured round the pits to retire rather than pulling off there and then. Prost's car was still going strong despite his gremlins, and with 22 laps to go, Mansell was still behind and some 3.7 seconds back. Senna was cruising along about 3 seconds ahead of Alesi, on course for 4 points, with the number 28 Ferrari seemingly unable to do anything about it. On lap 54, Mansell pulled back up behind Prost as they approached a gaggle of backmarkers, only to bushwhack the Ferrari around the outside of Adelaide before they got there. It was a great move, and if Prost wanted to try and take the place there next time around, he was to be disappointed because Mansell had just lapped Patrese, who proved unaccountably difficult to lap as Mansell disappeared up the road. By the time Prost had finally got past Ricciardo, Mansell was 3 seconds ahead and lapping Herbert and Martini. Modena came in to change tyres but seemed to get away slowly and was shortly back in to retire with a gear selection failure, while Piquet pitted for new tyres as his car was becoming undrivable, dropping behind Gugelmin and De Cesaris into 8th. As Mansell headed into the last 10 laps, Prost seemed to either be having renewed car trouble or have just given up and accepted second, now a fairly stable 4.5 to 5 seconds behind. Off-camera, meanwhile, De Cesaris got past Gugelmin into 6th, a great comeback after spinning while battling with the Leighton House early on and having to recover from 23rd. Alesi gathered himself for a charge as Senna slowed further, his onboard computer still insisting he was going to run out of fuel before the end, and Moreno pulled over exhausted. He'd been feeling under the weather all weekend, and after 63 high-intensity laps of Manny-Cours, he was just too ill to continue. With 4 laps left, Mansell had left Prost far behind, and both he and the team must have been crossing everything that he'd make it to the finish this time. Mauricio Gugelmin nearly made himself the hero of France by taking Mansell off at Adelaide, while Alesi was now right up behind Senna and trying to nab third at the death. Mansell wasn't to be denied this time, though, coming home to win the French Grand Prix, waving after he crossed the line, with Prost almost exactly 5 seconds behind, Senna holding off Alesi for third, Patrese 5th, and De Cesaris taking the final point for Jordan. Gugelmin finished 7th 2 laps down, despite having a 10-second penalty added after the race for ignoring the blue flags twice. Prost might have asked why Patrese or De Cesaris weren't penalised too. The Leighton House was followed home by Piquet, Martini, Herbert and the Ligiers, a pretty torrid debut for the new car on home tarmac, but the car had actually run pretty well when it wasn't coming in for some little teething problem or another. Mansell's win was not only his first of 1991 after 6 frustrating races, but the 17th of his career, which saw him overtake Stirling Moss to become the English driver with the most wins. The 2 Brits ahead of him in the all-time table, Jim Clark on 25 and Jackie Stewart on 27, both of course being Scots. Between them, Mansell and Prost had now won the French Grand Prix every year since 1986, which in addition to Prost's wins in 1981, his first win, and 1983, meant that they'd won it 8 times between them, while Senna had never triumphed on French soil. As Presidents Mitterrand and Balestre stoically endured God Save the Queen on the podium, they could take some small solace from the fact that it was a Renault engine in the winner's car, with French drivers 2nd and 4th, so not a complete washout for the home side, if only the engine manufacturer got an anthem as well. The race had been pretty entertaining up front at least, even if positions 3 through 5 didn't change hands for most of the race, and had certainly been a commercial success if not entirely an organisational one yet. Some remained to be convinced of the new track, but most went away in a more positive frame of mind, with the possible exception of the McLaren team, who were quite open about the shortcomings of their car and were promising a new one by Germany. In just 7 days' time they would all reconvene at Silverstone, where Mansell's win here would probably have put another few thousand on the gate and a couple of million on the TV viewing figures, as Northamptonshire braced once again for Mansell mania.